Welcome. This is Brooke and Karlie Dalton, and today we have Christopher Paolini with us, the international best-selling author of The Inheritance Cycle, also known as Eragon. And he also just released his new book, To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, which is a sci-fi fantasy, and it is amazing. I highly recommend reading it if you haven't read it already. And he has agreed to come talk to us today about writing. And I really think he's going to give you the tools that you need to be successful as an author. So welcome, Christopher Paolini, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Let's hop on over and meet Christopher.
We're really excited to have you on today.
I'm excited to be on.
I love the cover, To Sleep in a Sea of Stars. It's so beautiful.
Yeah, I really lucked out with this. The covers for The Inheritance Cycle are pretty striking and I perhaps even iconic at this point in the YA fantasy space. So we were really my team and I were really kind of, on the edge of our seats thinking like, are we going to have lightning strike twice and get another awesome cover? And we did. And I think that the folks over at the publishing house at Tor really knocked it out of the park with this, and the graphic designer they worked with. Yeah, it's a gorgeous, gorgeous cover. And I don't know if you know, but if you take the dust jacket off, you'll see there's a symbol embossed on the cover.
I love it. It's so pretty.
Yeah.
It's got that like metallic-y.
Yes, and I got that on this pin here too.
Oh, perfect.
So cool.
Which coincidentally enough, we have for sale in our Etsy store. So
Nice.
No, I feel like I'm gonna have to check that out. I have the Audible version, and she bought the physical copy, and now I have to go buy the physical copy too.
Well, I don't know if you know this, but with the Audible version, you can actually get a downloadable PDF that has all of the interior artwork that comes with the audiobook. So you're not being deprived of that, because there is a fair bit of art in the book, actually. I mean, there's 5 or 6 maps, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, cool.
And I love that stuff about books. It makes it more real to me.
Same. And I really wanted to put some effort into that to make sure that the package of the story was as beautiful as possible.
Mm-hmm. I feel like that's writers' like worst fear, is that they'll put all this work into a book and then like they'll get their cover back and it's just not what they imagined it to be. But
yeah, the flip side is covers that don't match what you had in your mind can still be effective covers. And that's where it gets really tricky, because the publishers have a lot of experience selling their books, marketing the books, and they have a general sense of what looks good and what doesn't. Doesn't mean they're always right, but they have a lot of experience with that. And because the artists and the graphic designers work on so many projects, they can't realistically read every single book they work on. So it's it's always an interesting experience trying to balance what the author wants versus what the publisher needs, and what the artist or graphic designer is imagining.
mm-hmm.
Interesting.
You typically like trust what your publisher decides.
Yes, I'm fortunate to work with some really skilled people. But that said, I have my own opinions and put them forth as strongly as I can. I think I'm in a slightly different position from some authors, because I also do a lot of the interior art for my books. So I did all the interior art for The Inheritance Cycle, including a bunch of pieces for various deluxe editions. And same for To Sleep in a Sea of Stars. I didn't do all the interior art. The rest of it was my amazing assistant, Emanuela. But
Oh yeah.
having a bit of an artistic background helps in, making those design decisions and figuring out what's going to look good and what won't.
Interesting.
So have you learned all of this on your own? Like how to do all this artwork?
Yeah. I when I started, there really weren't the internet resources that are now. So I just read a lot of art books and taught myself as best as I could. And then once the internet came around and YouTube tutorials started popping up, that was just like, groundbreaking. But there are also some really amazing books out there that are written by professional concept artists or professional artists like James Gurney. There's one called How to Draw, which is by concept artists. And that one is really spectacularly good. Really, the biggest thing that made the difference for me with my art is in the past few years, starting with digital art, which I always poo-pooed, but it's just so much more convenient. And when you're working in the publishing process, you have to convert to digital anyway for reproduction. So having the freedom to draw or paint something fast and not have to worry about the toxicity of the materials, being able to make changes really easily. I mean, there's a reason why all the concept artists work digitally these days, you know, and most of the book cover artists work digitally. And again, they have the ability to work traditionally, and some of them still do, but being able to do it on an iPad or a drawing tablet or something like that just allows you to be a lot more productive.
They come a long way with it too. I like to draw as well, and so I'll use the iPad and like the little easel and everything. And I'm like, it's actually like it has like the same kind of feel to it.
Yeah.
I prefer to do it traditionally, but it has come such a long way that it's not. I mean, it's bearable, especially if you're
So
new to download it.
there's a book that's published every year called Spectrum, and it's a collection of like the year's most acclaimed sci-fi fantasy art, and it's a great source for inspiration. Also, you can see all these different images and places and things. I've bought a bunch of them over the years. I really love it, actually. And when they started, I want to say it was late 90s, early 2000s, something like that, maybe late 90s. And the paintings that were digital, I could tell they were digital. You know, it was really easy to tell. They had that early collage-y, Photoshop-y look. And then it got to a point where there was a painting, and I forget what year it was, but there was a painting where I looked at it and I thought for sure it was an oil painting. And it was digital. I could not tell. Now, if I'd seen a printed reproduction, maybe I could have, or like a large print, maybe I could have seen. And same thing with like drawing. Like I have seen what look like pencil drawings, but they were just done in Procreate on the iPad.
Wow.
Which is crazy. And
Yeah.
I know a couple concept artists who've done art for like Black Panther and some of the Marvel movies, you know, costume design and other stuff. They're just working on an iPad. You know, they said, yeah, you know, I got my desktop, I got my whole powerful rig and everything, but, you know, I'm just on the sofa with my iPad, and this stuff is being used by, you know, movies with hundreds of millions of dollars for their budget.
Technology nowadays, man. It's come a long way.
I was drawing a map for my fantasy book on my iPad, trying to figure out how to draw like mesas and cliffs. It's actually pretty difficult, but
That is. I think that's really tricky, because if you're doing like a straight top-down view, it doesn't look like a mesa or a cliff. That's actually why in the map for Aragon, I did it on like almost like a angled view. It's actually kind of a weird view that I use for the map, because it is top down for the outlines of the geography, so the coastlines and everything. It's a top down view, but then the features of the landscape are sort of seen at a low angle that make them pop up in relief. But it was specifically to solve that problem.
That's really cool. So I want to ask you more about To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, because I know that that's your work right now that you're excited about and you're wanting to promote. So, and we've been reading it and we're just loving it. It's crazy.
Thank you.
Cool.
It's a big book.
Big,
Yeah.
but it's like I was talking to Brooke. I'm like, it's big, and I don't know how you're doing it. I'm almost like, it's like when you read, you want to read as a reader, but you also kind of want to read as a writer to dissect it. But it's like it doesn't drag on. There's no like really slow or boring. Like it's kept my attention the whole time, and I'm like, that's insane. Like,
thank you. Well, how far are the two of you into the book?
I'm just over at right where she shot the alien on the spaceship, so just over 100 pages.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm at the part where they're going after the blue staff.
Okay. Well, you may feel differently as you move forward further into the book, whether or not it's dragging or not. Pacing is such an individual thing. I read very fast. So for me, a book that's 800 pages or 900 pages the reading may feel long, and that depends on how it was written, but it's easy for me to read a book like that. So I don't really get daunted by that. But when I write, I very much try to, eliminate as much of the extraneous as possible. I did a lot of tricks in this book into Sleep to try to move things along, even though there's a lot of world building, there's a lot of character moments. So one thing is the book is divided into sections. The chapters themselves are divided into subchapters. That's something I shamelessly stole from Stephen King. And it really does help move scenes along and get you in and out of physical locations, because you can just go to a new subchapter instead of trying to describe how we get from point A to point B. You can cut almost like a movie.
and I haven't gotten confused. Sometimes I'm like, wait, now where are we, or what's going on, or how much time's passed? And that's that little gap. It's like, okay, lets you know, okay, new scene.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Very
Well,
well.
well, I'm glad both of you are enjoying it. I hope you enjoy the
I'll
rest of
definitely
it.
finish it. Like I absolutely am. I love Kira. Like I'm definitely attached and have to know how it's gonna end.
Well, the goal with the book was, aside from like me sort of paying tribute to science fiction and the science fiction that I loved reading growing up, was also to essentially write a whole series in one book, a complete story in one book. And I personally feel that when I get to the end of the story and I look back on the journey Kira's gone through and everything that happens, I have a bit of a sense of like, wow, we started here and we ended up here. That's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And to convey that, there's actually one extra beat in this story. You know, I'm sure you've both heard of the whole, 3-act structure for a story, right? 3 acts, 3 acts. Not every story fits into a 3-act structure. This one actually does not. This is a 4-act story, you could say. And I did that deliberately in order to give it that epic feel, I guess.
Yeah.
You know? Whether or not that's entirely successful, have to leave it up to you to decide.
So what is the 4th act? Like the additional act that you added?
You're in it right now. You're starting to read it. The 4th act is what you're about to read in the book. The whole Staff of Blue thing.
Uh-huh. How different is it from the midpoint?
So in a 3-act structure, the midpoint is hard to, I mean, you can just go by length and just say the midpoint is exactly in the middle of the 2nd act, because you can't divide 3 by 4 and have it work out equally. So, or divide it by 2, it doesn't work. So traditionally with a 3-act structure, the end of the 2nd act is the lowest point in the story. Assuming you're not writing a tragedy, then the end of the 2nd act is your lowest point. You know, everything seems lost. It's the dark night of the soul. All the difficulties have piled onto our main characters, and it's kind of like, how do we proceed? How could we possibly proceed? And, are we going to proceed? And then the characters have to decide that for themselves. And then, of course, even in that 3rd act, you still pile even more difficulties on, but the characters have already decided at that point. Are we pursuing to the end? Are we going to commit? So a 4th act, you slot in between Act 2 and Act 3, which means that Act 2 is not your dark night of the soul. It's a continuation of the journey that was begun in Act 2. So it's almost like more journey, more discovery, more growth for the characters. And then you get your dark night of the soul leading into that final act. Long serialized stories tend to have a lot of these. So long, like Lord of the Rings, if you look at it in its entirety, not just one book, if you look at it in its entirety, some Bollywood films have much more than 3 acts. So it's a different structure.
That's really interesting. So what gave you like that initial like spark of like the idea for this To Sleep in a Sea of Stars?
Well, I love sci-fi and fantasy, and I love them both for different reasons. Fantasy, this is a broad generalization, there are exceptions, but fantasy is often a very nostalgic genre. So, it's, again, it doesn't have to be, but if we're talking about traditional, epic fantasy, it's pre-industrial, it's mythic, you're out in the woods, you're tromping around, there are castles, there are swords, there are monsters, and that gives it some real epic mythic power, and I love it for that. And then science fiction is often a very forward-looking genre, and it speaks of the future, it speaks of what humanity could become, of what other creatures might be out there, new ways of living in life, and I love that too, because in the real world, I'm incredibly curious about the universe we live in, and I think it would be amazing to go out and explore, and I think humans are going to go out and explore. I'm actually very optimistic about that. But as far as like specific inspiration, I mean, it was all the authors and movies and shows I watched growing up. I mean, I love the Alien films, of course, Babylon 5, Heinlein, Asimov, Clarke, Ursula K. Le Guin, Andre Norton, Star Trek, original series and Next Generation Star Trek, The Prisoner, the original Prisoner television show, which is pretty bonkers. So all of those kind of fed into my desire to write this story.
So it's like a conglomeration of ideas.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. And then
What gave you the
trying to put
idea
my
for
own.
the suit, though? Like,
Sorry?
like a living suit. What gave you that idea?
You know, I had an answer for this, and I'm completely blanking at the moment. It was a combination of a lot of things. So one, like Starship Troopers, they have their power armor in Starship Troopers. That's kind of like the original sci-fi power armor story. There was the idea of, you know, the problem is it's been so long since I started the book. I'm having trouble putting a finger on it. Yeah, I mean, thinking about some of the superhero stories also, you know, the character acquiring power and learning to use it and becoming joined with that. A lot of the sci-fi stories involve symbiotes, parasites, alien life forms that you become joined with, and you have to learn to work with or overcome. So all of that was sort of bouncing around in my head.
I do love that about the suit. It's given her all this power, but it does have its negatives, you know, where she doesn't feel like she can control it. She accidentally kills people that she loves.
Yeah, it's definitely a problem for the main character, and that's the whole point of the story, is her having to learn to deal with this problem and what it means to her and to the characters around her. Yeah, I know when the book got released, there were a number of people who were saying they saw some similarities with the Venom movie, which was amused me but highly annoyed me because I've never actually seen it nor read any Venom comics. So I was like, darn it.
I haven't watched it either, but I've seen the previews for it.
Yeah.
I think that can be almost said with anything. Like, there's no true original idea. Everything's kind of like reimagined in some kind of way.
Yeah.
It's like people are going to find similarities where they want to find it.
And it doesn't bother me because you can take an idea and explore it in different ways. You know, what I'm doing with this story is not, to my understanding, what Venom does with its story, or thinking of symbiotic suits, for example. There's what was that old movie, Spawn, which was like another comic book movie back in the late 90s. You know, I'm not doing that with this story, and it wasn't really the inspiration. I mean, honestly, what started me on the path to writing this was two things. It was the image in my head of Kira finding the dust and the dust crawling over her. That image right there. And then, without spoiling things, the very last image in the book. And everything else, almost 10 years of my life, 900 some pages, everything was to support those two images.
Wow. I think I read I didn't read too much of the acknowledgments because I'm like, oh, I don't want any spoilers, but I read just a little bit. And I think you're saying that you started thinking about this book back when you were still reading or writing the Inheritance cycle. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I had the idea. Yeah, that idea was back in 2006. That's kind of why sometimes I'm having trouble remembering sometimes exactly where the inspirations came from, because a lot of water under the bridge since then. But yeah, I was working on, I think I was between Eldest and my third book, Brisingr. Yeah, or maybe I was between Brisingr and Inheritance. I can't even remember at this point. No, it must have been between Eldest and Brisingr. And I had this idea, and I wanted to write it as a short book or something, or as a screenplay. And the idea was Kira finding this artifact, and then again that final image. And I wrote like the first 2 or 3 pages, and then I just let it sit. I just let it sit because I didn't know what to do with it, and I didn't want to. I knew it was going to take time away from the Inheritance cycle, and I had to finish that. So it sat and it sat and it sat, and then in 2013, I was doing research for the Fractalverse, which is the setting. That's what this logo stands for, which is the setting for the book. And I wrote a short prequel novel for To Sleep in 2013. And then 2014, end of 2013, 2014 is when I really started writing To Sleep. So it's been a long, long involved process.
How much research did you do before you started writing?
I did a solid year of research because I've always been a science nerd, but my understanding of the technology and the physics was not where it needed to be to write this book. So I just dove into it, and I was willing to put that amount of research and time in because I knew this was going to be a setting that I plan to write many other stories in, whether they're modern day, real world stories, or far future or distant past. If it's not fantasy, it's going to be in the fractal verse from here on out for me. So the investment was worth it. But I also set myself some specific challenges, which gave me a lot of difficulty. So one of those challenges was, since the fractal verse encompasses the real world, I have to take all of known science into account. I can't contradict stuff that we know to be true. And I knew I wanted faster than light travel in order to move my characters around in a reasonable amount of time instead of it taking hundreds or thousands of years. Science as we know it says that's not possible, or if it is possible, you'd have a time machine. You know, if you could travel faster than light, your spaceship would be a time machine. And there are some solutions to that. People have hypothesized wormholes. They've hypothesized this form of a warp drive. I'm probably butchering the name, but the Albuquerque warp drive has been bandied about a little bit. But all of those either have a severe disadvantage of one type or another, or B, have been used already by some other sci-fi franchise. As an example of one of the disadvantages, the warp drive that's been proposed, A, needs negative mass, which has never been proven to exist, and B, the bubble, the distortion of space-time around the ship that allows it to move along would collect particles and photons and basically energy along the surface of the bubble as it moves through space-time. So you basically end up with this shock wave at the front of the bubble. And then when you arrive at your destination and you pop the bubble, you turn off your warp drive and the bubble vanishes, all of that energy that got trapped on the front of the wave, front of the bubble, would get released in a burst, and it would be an incredibly deadly burst. It'd be like a gamma ray burst, which, could destroy your ship and or, sterilize a good chunk of the planet in front of you that you were flying to. So there are problems like that. So I just was tearing my hair out researching and reading, and I ended up finding a theory, not a theory of everything, but pretty close, a theory that this rocket engineer, scientist guy, Greg Mahalik, came up with along with a couple of other folks, and it gave me what I needed. The theory has not been proven. It's entirely hypothetical, but it gave me what I needed. So I contacted him and said, hey, I'm working on this book. Could you talk me through this theory if you don't mind? And he was nice enough to spend hours and hours and hours walking me through the theory and how it would work and what the practical implications would be. And that formed the basis for my faster than light technology. And that was just one area of research that I was working on. And I think that it resulted in something different than I would have ended up before. And that's been my experience with research, is the questions where you want to just skim past something because it's problematic for your story. It's like, the story you want to write, and that if you dig into this one issue, it might make it impossible for you to write the story you want to write, like, faster than light travel equaling time travel. My experience is those problematic things actually result in a better story and a better world building if you really commit to solving the issue. Mm-hmm. So whenever I get that sense when I'm plotting or world building, whenever I get the urge to ignore something, that to me is usually the key to go investigate it a lot more.
If you're enjoying this video and you like the content, please like, subscribe, and ring the bell so that you're notified when our next videos are up.
Did you just not want time travel to be possible because you didn't want people to be like, oh, why doesn't she just go back in time and say that?
Well, yes. I mean, I have nothing against time travel as a storytelling device. I just don't want every single spaceship to also be a time machine, because then that makes it too easy, too casual. So if I do time travel, it'll be in a different way. And also time travel is a great example of, without going into the weeds too much, time travel has specific problems with it that most most modes of time travel that have been invented ignore in order to make it work. So along with solving the faster than light issue, I did dive into the time travel stuff, and I came up with a solution for time travel that I don't think anyone's quite used what I've come up with. So I'm really pleased with that, and I want to use it at some point.
Well, that would be really cool. Do you have any ideas for what you'd use it for, or you just?
Oh, it's all plotted out. It's all ready to go.
Wow.
Really?
Something to look forward to in the future, maybe.
Yeah, I know it. You know, I'm sure both of you know, it's with writing, it's always a question of time.
Yes.
For sure. And it probably won't be in a sequel to this book, right? Because you said this is the one, a single book that's the whole series, right?
There will be more stories in the Fractalverse, and we will even see some of these characters again, but this particular story is finished.
So will it be a little bit like The Fork, the Witch, and the Worm, where they're just short stories?
No, probably full-size novels. I mean, it's like I said, so the Fractalverse really is like a giant playground that I can write whatever I want in it. And then if I want to write fantasy, I have the world of Aragon to play around in.
Mm-hmm. That's really cool. So what was your favorite part that you wrote? You mentioned the dust and then the end, right? Are those your two favorite scenes that you wrote?
I think I have a couple of them, and I'm trying to avoid spoilers here.
Yeah, we will put a little thing. I know it's like if we haven't finished it either, but it's like hard to not give spoilers because we also still want to hear your inspiration.
Yeah.
So.
Well, there's I don't know if you would have encountered it yet, Brooke, but there's a discussion of newts in the book that I found immensely fun to write. There are lots of puns in the conversation. You'll know when you get there, newts. And then there is a action sequence following the section that you're currently reading. There's an action sequence on a space station, and it was actually really tricky to write. Very complicated physics. I used a design for a space station that I haven't read about before. I came across it from an old catalog or space magazine from like the 1950s, and it had some crazy action sequence, a lot of fun to write, and then just a lot of the character moments. You know, a lot of the character moments that are why I wanted to write this story. Action's fun, but without the characters, who cares about the action?
Yeah,
for sure. And actually, following that, did you outline like your characters and your character development and then figure out the scenes and research those scenes when you were researching for a year?
So I took a two-pronged approach. I was researching the world, the setting, as I was outlining the story. And I try to do those things as much as possible together because they influence each other. So, you know, what is physically possible in the setting of your story will dictate a lot of, you know, your travel times. Again, you know, how fighting might happen. You know, do we have lasers? Do we have magic wands? What are the limitations of both? How would you defend against them? Things like that really dictate the physical realities that your character in. And then at the same time, who your characters are is a product of the life they've led and the culture they've been in. And so it goes back to world building, but then of course, you know, the characters can shape the world to a degree. So there's a lot of interaction back and forth. I don't think you can, at least for me, I don't think I can separate the story from the world and vice versa. But since the world does shape the story a lot, I try to give it a lot of attention as I'm working out the story.
And you did a really, really good job at your world building into Sleep with the Sea of Stars. Do you have any tips or any like tricks that you use for world building that you can share with other writers?
Ooh, I mean, everyone does it differently, and there's a lot of ways to do it. I think the one thing every author would agree on is internal consistency. So you can come up with any world you want, any setting you want, but you just need to be internally consistent with the rules you've established. So, you know, if in your setting you can pray to the gods and sometimes they'll listen to you, great. If instead you go shout at your engineer down in the spaceship engine room and tell him to make the spaceship go 110% faster, you know, maybe he can make that happen. But be consistent. And that is the most immersion breaking thing for myself when I read a book, when something happens and I'm sitting there going, why was this allowed? Why couldn't you do this earlier? Why have you never thought of this? Why? And it's hard because, let's take fantasy, for example. There are a lot of different ways to handle magic. Well, okay, so there's a famous saying from, I think it was Arthur C. Clarke, who said something like, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Okay, there's a corollary to that, which I wish I had invented, which says that any sufficiently explained system of magic is indistinguishable from science.
Huh.
So when it comes to magic, there are like two big ways you could go. You could be very mechanistic and say, in order to cast a spell, these are the steps you follow. If you follow these steps, you will cast your spell. This is exactly how it works. And you understand every single element. And then there's what you could say is the mythic side of magic, where Lord of the Rings is a great example. We do not understand how the One Ring works. We don't really understand how Gandalf is able to cast spells or use magic. We don't understand the limits on it. We don't understand the mechanics of how it happens. It simply happens when it needs to happen. The downside of that is if a unskilled writer uses that type of magic, then it feels as if whenever the characters are in trouble, there's a get out of jail free card that happens with the magic. Things just happen because they need to happen. But that said, it's also the logic of dreams. And so mythic magic can be the most powerful emotionally if it's done correctly. So that's one tricky thing. I mean, ultimately with world building, I would say, start with the physical realities of your world. Like, what are the constraints? How does the technology work? How does the magic work? How do the culture, societies work? Where are your locations? That's where a map can come in handy. What are the travel times? A lot of people like to fudge on the travel times. I've even done it a few times myself, but being a stickler for that gives you a physical reality. Umberto Eco had a wonderful, or he had a firm belief. I would give you the exact quote, but I can't. But he had a firm belief in having a deep understanding of the locations your characters are in, down to the millimeter, as he said. You don't have to overload your reader with that, but it really, really does help. And I keep notes for all of that stuff. I write it all by hand, and then I transfer it into Word files. When I have final information, I say, okay, this is what it's going to be. Then I put it into a Word file. And I keep track of it all the character names, all the languages, all the places, all the things. And it might sound like a lot of work, and it is, but I'll tell you what, it's a lot easier and it's less work to do it that way than to be halfway through the book and say, I can't remember what this character's name is. I can't remember where they come from. I can't remember what the distance is from point A to point B. I can't remember, it's too much to hold in your head. So keeping notes is actually less work down the road. And if you're so lucky as to have a successful published book, then you may have a sequel and you're going to need to reference all that material again years after you started working on it. You may need to do companion works, like in the world of, an atlas or something, behind the scenes. So anyway, it just helps to have all the information organized and on hand.
Yeah. When you wrote Eragon, did you have the whole series outlined, or did you just write Eragon and then figured you'd figure the rest of it out later?
I was very methodical. I had the idea for the story, and I had a couple ideas for stories, and I tried writing them in my early to mid-teens, and I never got past the first 5 or 6 pages because all I had was the idea, not the story. To clarify that point, an idea would be a young man finds a dragon egg. Great, awesome. That's not a story because it doesn't tell you what happens, why it happens, and where it goes. So I tried writing a couple of things and got very frustrated because I only got 5 or 6 pages in, and then I hit this rock wall, and I don't know what to do next. I cannot write if I don't know where it's going. I cannot plot and write at the same time, not to mention world building at the same time. So I stopped writing. I was about 14 into 15. I stopped writing for about a year. And I did nothing but read books on how to write. Now, I was very fortunate that my parents had noticed my interest in writing, and all these books on writing just magically appeared in the house. In fact, I still have a couple of them here. Like, Here, this one's from 1998. This is the Writer's Handbook, which is a collection of essays on how to write by authors in different genres. And we had this for a couple of different years. One's going back to, say, 1988, 2001, 2002. So books like that started popping up in our house, and I read this stuff, and I realized that I had a severe lack of understanding about the structure of stories. I didn't even realize that you could consciously control the structure of a story. So I gave myself a challenge. I said, I'm going to create a fantasy world and a fantasy story, and I'm going to plot the whole story out start to finish, and I'm not going to write it. I'm going to do this as an exercise. And I did. I created a whole world, created a whole story. It was about a princess named ARYA, and then I shelved it. And then I told myself, okay, I know I can create a plot. Now I'm going to create a new fantasy world. I'm going to plot out a new story, but this time it's going to be a trilogy, because all great fantasy stories are trilogies. And I'm going to write the first book in the trilogy as a practice novel, just to see if I can produce something that's 300, 400, 500 pages long, because again, the longest I'd ever written was about 6 to 10 pages. And that is exactly what I did. And that trilogy was what ended up becoming the Inheritance cycle. So I plotted out the first book in very specific detail, and then a little less detail, much more broad strokes for the following books. And that outline held pretty well throughout the course of the Inheritance cycle. A couple of things changed in the last book because I just got to know the characters better, and I understood the story better, and there were some things that I was intending to do, but that I had not laid the groundwork for in order to pull it off, and different options were more appealing at that point. But in general, yeah, I had the outline. And then before I tackled each individual book, I would outline that specific book in greater detail so that I really knew what I was trying to do.
Are you going to do anything with the Princess ARYA that you outlined?
Oh man, I don't know. I mean, I went back and looked at that outline at some point. It's still, I think there's still a story there. Maybe one of these days.
I would read it. That would be really cool. Actually, so I have a couple questions around ARYA. So a lot of, like, growing up, I would read a lot of books where, there was the lead male character who has these powers and can do all these cool things. And at the end of the book or the end of the series, the girl that he has a crush on finally realizes how amazing he is and falls in love with him. One of my favorite series, Avatar: The Last Airbender. Have you watched that show?
I have. I just watched it for the first time last year, I think.
I love it so much. One of the biggest criticisms of that show that I've heard is at the very end, Katara has this like brotherly relationship, right, with Aang, and then at the very end she decides she likes him because he's super powerful. But you didn't do that with Arya and Eragon. So I'm wondering if you were trying to say something with that, or what your intention was with that.
I didn't do anything, much to the complete dismay of my readership, I think. I wanted to. I mean, I really tried to push them together. That was the original plan. Back when I was originally thinking of the series as a trilogy, I actually, this is kind of embarrassing to admit, but in the second book, there's this celebration that my elves have that Eragon participates in. And I actually had Eragon and Arya spend the night together, and in the first draft. And my editor came back and said, no, bad author, no. Smack, do better. And then by the time I got to the last book, the fourth book, I thought I had laid the groundwork for the two of them to actually have a serious relationship and be together. And again, I wrote the first draft of the book that way, with that relationship happening. And it just didn't work. And in retrospect, I can totally understand why, because ultimately Arya is, she's 120 some years old, give or take. And Eragon is 17 by the end of the books. He's a kid. And my thought process had been that he, and this is a spoiler for a series that's been out for a while, but by the end of the series, he's been exposed to these Eldenari, these dragon mines that are hundreds of years old, and he's sort of, you know, had all their memories dumped in his brain. And my thought was, well, you know, that makes him more mature than he would be otherwise. Yes, but you don't change overnight. It takes you time to understand information, time to understand memories. So yeah, I mean, that's a great example of, you know, you can have all your best laid plans and you can try to make your characters do something and it just may not work with them. And I'm glad I didn't ultimately have them end up together, because it made the ending a lot more bittersweet in some ways.
Mhm.
And I love bittersweet endings. To me, the greatest endings are bittersweet, because pure tragedy always feels false to me. Well, maybe not false. You know, you can have great tragedy. I mean, Shakespeare is a great example, of course, but it's difficult. Tragedy is difficult for obvious reasons. And conversely, endings that are 100% happy also ring false, because life is neither 100% happy nor 100% sad. It's that bittersweet quality. And that's something I always try to capture, because to me, it means more to me than just something that is, again, purely perfect or purely horrible.
Yeah. And I think I felt that way at the end of the series, where like I didn't know whether I was happy about it or not.
But at least you felt something, and that's important.
Uh-huh. And I liked that it was different. It wasn't what I expected.
Thank you. Well, yeah, you know, it's if I had forced those relationship things on those characters, I think it would have made ARYA a lot less interesting and a lot less unique.
Yeah. And that was one thing I actually didn't love as much about the movie. It was that it seemed like she liked him a lot more than she did in the books.
I'm sorry, what movie?
The movie of Eragon.
They made a movie? I never heard about this.
Oh, I love it.
I mean, she watched it yesterday.
Like, oh, it's on Disney Plus. I'll do this refresher.
It is kind of crazy though that ARYA is now technically a Disney princess.
That is crazy.
Really? That's
Yeah,
true.
yeah. Disney owns the film rights, so she's technically a Disney princess.
I never thought about that. That's awesome. My husband makes fun of me all the time because I'll watch just about any movie and love it, and I loved the Eragon movie and I bought it.
Well, I mean, I love to rag on it, but the thing is that the movie suffers more by comparison with the book than it does simply looking at it as a film. And it brought a lot of, I mean, it literally brought millions of readers to the series. So as the author, I can't complain about that. I'm very happy that those readers came to the series. And, you know, hopefully we'll get a reboot at some point and a remake. That would certainly make me happy.
I hope so. I hope they stay true to Arya's character.
Yeah, and you know, I was really fortunate to have a film adaptation. Most books don't get film adaptations, so I really lucked out.
Speaking of which, we saw in iWriterly that you and your sister are working on a screenplay for To Sleep in a Sea of Stars.
Yeah.
How is that going?
It's going well. We're currently in discussions with the producers about a couple of storytelling choices in the screenplay right now. It's difficult because I'd love to talk about the process in greater detail because I find it fascinating, and I'm sure our viewers would find it interesting also. But it's until things are more settled, I think I'd be talking out of turn to go into the behind the scenes stuff.
Sure.
But it's moving forward. It's going well. We seem to be producing professional, high quality script writing, which is a real win for us because, you know, taking something from book format and converting it into a script is a difficult thing to do. And it's a huge shift for me. Fortunately for me, my sister Angela has been writing scripts for a while and has a much better brain for what works in a script versus what works in a novel. You can get away with things in books you just can't get away with in scripts, and vice versa. It's a completely different medium. So it's very easy as an author to think, oh well, I know how to adapt my book. You know, you just do X, Y, Z. You know, why are you having so much trouble getting what's in the book? You know, and there is some truth to that. But it's also just completely different, because in a film, and I know I'm stating the obvious, but you can't get inside the head of your character in this way you can with a book. You can do voiceovers, you can do this, you can do that, but a lot of those are literary techniques. Great films show, and they don't tell, they show. And so figuring out what a visual representation is of the character's mood, of the character's desires, of the character's thoughts is difficult. It is not appropriate for younger viewers, but the movie Gone Girl was based on a book, and it was adapted by the author, and she did a fantastic job of adapting it. That's a great example of an author being able to translate their work into a visual medium and doing it well. And of course, she was able to collaborate with David Fincher, who's a master of his craft. So,
when do you expect that will come out?
As soon as humanly possible, but that's the answer for every project. Once we, if it's going to happen, and I say if because Hollywood is a unique and interesting place. If it happens, it will happen once the script is where it needs to be. So that's the answer. Nothing moves forward until the script is where everyone's happy with it.
For sure.
Interesting.
And it's tricky because To Sleep in a Sea of Stars is 308,000 words long, and scripts tend to be around 30,000 words long, give or take.
So is that hard to condense it down into that?
Yeah, it's extremely hard. If you actually read a screenplay, they're much more like short stories than they are like books, which is why a lot of the more successful adaptations tend to be from shorter books or short stories. I mean, like Shawshank Redemption is adapted from a short story, as an example. So is The Green Mile, I think. So oftentimes short stories work better. I mean, also, like, you can see the troubles they've had adapting Dune over the years. And that's also because of the size of the book and the size of the story.
Is it fun to do the dialogue? You said one of your favorite things that you wrote was the dialogue, the witty dialogue. Do you do a lot of witty dialogue in the screenplay that's fun to play around with?
I thought you kept your puns too with your editor. You're just sleeping.
If you have the space, that's the thing. You have to have the space to do it. And that's one of the tricky bits with an adaptation, because if you try to cram every bit of action in, you have only time for utilitarian dialogue. That is the dialogue that literally just moves you from one piece of information to the next, or one action to the next. So to have time for dialogue that sounds like actual people talking with actual people, or dialogue that is not always 100% essential to the next action, you need space. And that either means you sacrifice parts of the story, or you have to change format and say, okay, this is no longer a film, this is a mini series, or this is going to be 8 episodes of something, right? I mean, that's also what they had to do with Game of Thrones. You really couldn't adapt those books as films unless you were willing to essentially do a TV show as films.
Yeah.
That's what I feel like they should do with Aragon, because it was almost like too much information into just a movie. If they spread it out over a series, I think it would be amazing.
A lot of people have said that to me. And I used to resist that because I always saw it as a film, as being inherently cinematic. But the CGI, the special effects have gotten so good in the past few years that, yeah, I think you could do it, but you would have to throw a lot of money at it. And I think that's been the biggest stumbling block for an adaptation, like on Disney Plus or somewhere else. Is, it's not like Percy Jackson where you can throw in a couple of special effects here or there. Saphira the dragon has to be a main character. She's going to be 100% CGI, and she needs to be around. I mean, if you start minimizing her and putting her off on the side and just making it more about Eragon, you kind of lose what makes the series the series. And that's without going into Urgles or elves or dwarves, or, I mean, it's like you're committing to a Lord of the Rings style budget and story for a television show. So I still think it'd be worth doing, and hopefully we'll get the right partners for that one of these days, but we'll see.
What is like your cure for writer's block? Or do you believe in such a thing?
I mean, writer's block does exist, but I think there are some specific causes and some specific cures for writer's block. I personally have not experienced writer's block in a very, very, very long time. So the first cause of writer's block would be you just don't want to write. Like you're trying to write, but you don't actually want to write. I don't have a cure for that. If that happens to be your particular issue, you need to sort out your own motivations, your own life circumstances, whatever it is that's causing you this difficulty. I write for a living. I write because I love stories, and both of those are huge motivations for me. So I'm not going to sit down and say, oh man, I don't feel like writing. No, I feel like writing. The other forms of writer's block that I've seen tend to be, one, you want to write, but you don't know what to write. So in that case, I would say plot your story out beforehand, get your roadmap settled, make it so that when you sit down in front of your computer, you know exactly what the scene needs to be, what it's going to do, where the characters are going to go, how they're going to feel, how they're going to change. You don't do that work when you're trying to write. You do it before, and then you can really just focus on the writing. Cause number two for writer's block would be you think you know what you want to write, but you don't actually know what you want to write. So as an example of this would be what I was doing with Eragon and ARYA, where I thought I knew what I wanted to write and I kept trying to write it and it wasn't right for the characters. And as a result, every time this happens with me, I find the writing gets more and more difficult. It just grinds. And it grinds because my subconscious and even my conscious is saying, this doesn't feel correct. Something's off emotionally or even pacing wise. You know, if I'm writing a scene and it's going on too long, I start losing interest in it. Although you have to be careful with that because the time it takes a writer to write a story is not the time it takes the reader to read the story. And so your experience of the pacing is very different than the readers, which is why writers are so bad at judging pacing, is why you need an editor sometimes to help you with pacing. So if this occurs to you, this type of writer's block where you think you know what to write, but it's still not going well because there's some internal resistance, then the best solution, and also for the earlier forms also, is to walk away from the computer, grab a notebook, and start writing a conversation to yourself. That's what I do. I literally speak to myself on the page. I say, I wonder why this is difficult. Should I do this? Why is this character doing this? Is there a problem here? Alternatively, go grab a family member or a friend that you trust and verbally tell them the sequence of events, tell them the story. And the reason this almost always fixes it is because humans are born storytelling animals. We convey information through the structure of stories. Even if it's nonfiction, you know, if you say in a scientific process, A causes B causes C, which leads to D, guess what? That's a story. So if you tell the story verbally, you will usually identify the problem really fast and be able to fix it. I mean, just like when you watch a movie and it doesn't work, you usually know why it doesn't work and you can articulate it to someone else. So that's been a great way to solve those issues for me. The last issue or type of writer's block is in some ways maybe the most difficult, and that would be if you're writing about a subject that you find emotionally problematic for whatever reason. Maybe you've had some past trauma in your own life. Maybe the subject material is just really dark and that, you know, is affecting your own mood. But for whatever reason, if the subject material itself is starting to affect your mood and causing you some issues, then that's something you're gonna have to deal with. I'm not sure what the solution is for that, quite honestly. Well, actually, I do know, you know, therapy might actually be the answer if that's the case, you know, professional help. Personally, I find that writing helps me deal with the large questions of life. And so writing is sort of a form of therapy for me. And I know that's true for a lot of writers. But if you are writing about something that causes you emotional distress and you can't seem to resolve that through the writing itself, then either write about something that you find cheerier or speak to someone who can help you resolve those issues so that then you can be a productive writer.
Yeah.
Long answer to a short question.
Yeah, no, that was, I think, fantastic. We got a lot of questions on that too, so I think viewers would love to
well,
hear.
and you know, there is another form of writer's block, which is where you become self-conscious, right? You're scared of what people are going to think. You're scared that your work isn't going to be any good, and so you lock up. It's like performance anxiety. I don't get that anymore. I got that a few times when I was younger. But the reason I don't get that anymore is I have a proven track record in my own life of being able to produce writing that is professional and publishable. So that's a good source of confidence for myself. But if you don't have that, if you're starting out, it can be really difficult to overcome that sense of, you know, oh God, is it good enough? Is this going to work? Am I wasting my time? And I'd say trust the process. The process is you write, you edit, you write bad stuff, you edit it, you make it better. Repeat ad nauseum for 10 years. And you're going to be a much better writer at the end of 10 years than you were when you started. But you have to ultimately decide what's important to you. And I mean this very seriously. This is a philosophical question. There is an ultimate deadline that we all have. I have so many years that I can write productively, and past that, I can't count on being able to write. And then ultimately, I won't be able to write any more stories at all. I have a certain number of years to write stories. To me, the thought of not being able to write those stories and not being able to, let's say, support my family are more scary than the thought of, oh God, am I good enough to write this story? So that fear outweighs this fear. And I'm not saying you have to write from a place of fear, you know, that's not necessarily healthy, but you also need to have some sort of motivation that pushes you past that initial resistance of how do I start? Is it good enough? Robert E. Howard, who wrote the Conan the Barbarian stories, this is apocryphal, maybe, I don't know how true this is, but very famously, he supposedly believed that Conan the Barbarian was standing behind him with a battle axe and was going to chop off his head if he didn't write these stories. He was a little off mentally, but he was ridiculously prolific.
Yeah, whatever the drive.
So whatever it is, you need to find the answer for yourself that gets you to put your butt in the seat and do the work consistently, because that's what makes the difference.
And do you know what your own motivation is?
Yeah, I love stories. Good stories, whether they're books or movies or even music, give me a physical reaction. I get a tingle up my spine. I get an emotional release of endorphins, especially at the ending of a good story. It's hard to find. It gets harder to find as I get older, but nothing else really gives me that feeling aside from maybe, you know, climbing a mountain and looking at some beautiful natural landscape. So I'm chasing the high, so to speak, by writing these stories. I'm trying to replicate that feeling I got and trying to share it with readers. In addition to that, as I said, this is my profession. So, you know, putting food on the table and keeping a roof over the head is a good motivation also. Yeah, and I have just a wonderful fandom also. I love my readers, and I want to share these stories with my readers.
Mm-hmm.
Did you enjoy writing Kira's character, and what made you want to write a female lead?
I wanted to write a female lead because at least when I was growing up in the 90s, there weren't as many sci-fi female lead characters. I mean, we have a lot more now, but there weren't as many in the 90s. And I was a big fan of, you know, the Alien films with Ripley. And I was a big fan of, you know, the first two Terminator films with Linda Hamilton's character, Sarah Connor. And I was as a, you know, fan of those, I was looking around at the landscape back then and going, you know, where are more of these characters? Give me more of these characters. I also like to challenge myself. I'm not saying I did the greatest job in the world writing Kira. I did the very best I could. But I like to challenge myself as a writer. I've also, you know, I'd written a number of female POVs in Inheritance Cycle. I wrote the character of Nasawada, even Saphira a little bit. And so it was a fun thing to change it up and do something else. Was she difficult to write? She was difficult to write, not because she was a woman, but because I went through a long process of really nailing down who I thought she was and what her motivations were. And that was the difficult part, not the fact that she was a woman and I'm a man or anything like that. Also, I was not trying to focus on any sort of perceived stereotypical differences between men and women, because when you start to do that, I think unless you're extremely skilled, male or female, as an author, you start to run into pitfalls.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So would that be your like number one tip that you would give writers if they're writing two different genders, is just making sure that they're not falling into those stereotypical pitfalls?
If you can. I mean, the difficult bit is, okay, so if you take a man who, the easy way to write the opposite sex would be to simply write them as your own sex/gender and not try to think of anything else. So that would be a man writing a woman, but just writing it like a male character, right? Writing them like a male character, or a woman writing a male character, but writing it the same way as they would write a female character, right? That's the easy way to do it. And it's safe, and it might work, it probably does work. But you end up then sometimes with characters who behave in ways where you look at it and go, that just doesn't quite feel right, and I can't quite put my finger on it. The other thing, though, is that life is very individual, and this is something that I found very interesting publishing To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, because I got some criticism from some female readers who really objected to a couple points in the book and said, this does not feel like this is what a woman would do. They felt very strongly about it and wanted to express those views. And I think that's a perfectly valid viewpoint, that I felt that way. I also had, on those exact same points, some women write to me and say, I love how you wrote this. This felt so true to me and to my experience. So, and I think that some of the criticism wouldn't have been leveled if I had been a woman writing those exact same scenes. It makes me an easy target to be a guy writing those scenes. So should I have written those scenes differently? I literally don't know, because I have conflicting information from different sources. So all I can say is you write the scenes that make sense to you, the author, and to who you think these characters are. And that's what I really try to focus on. I don't think of Kira as I'm trying to write a woman. I'm trying to write her, this person. Same thing with the male characters. I'm not trying to write a man. I'm trying to write this person, whoever this person is. And it's not easy.
No. As long as you know your character and their flaws and their past history, and you keep true to that.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, and everyone falls in that trap of thinking your own experience is universal. I fall in that trap too, and it's really important to remember that just because your experiences have gone a certain way doesn't mean everyone else's. It's really interesting to me. There was I read some of the Ferrante books. I don't know if you're familiar with. What are those books? They're the Napoleon. I cannot remember. I'm horrible with titles and names. One second. Yeah, Elena Ferrante, the Neapolitan books. And I was reading the first one, and to me, now I'm going to stereotype here for a second. I don't think a man could write those books, or it would be a very unusual man. It just felt like she was so good at what she was doing, and it was so tied into a female viewpoint, if you will. And it was incredibly well done. And at least the reason I say a man couldn't do it is I can't think of a male author that I know who could do it. Maybe there is one, right? Conversely, there is a fantasy series called the Mabinogion Tetralogy, which is a retelling of Welsh mythology by Evangeline Walton. Beautiful novelization of these Welsh myths and legends, incredible writing. She writes male characters better than most men do. And when I read it, I was like, that rang true to me. It's like the vocabulary, the voice, the feeling. I was like, yes, you nailed it. And I can point to a couple of male authors that I think can go back and forth also. So it really is an individual skill. And sometimes it just feels very much like, yes, you're an author who can do X, Y, Z, or you're an author who can do X, Y, Z, and you can play to your strengths.
Yeah, for sure. If you could give yourself, like, if you go back to when you were 15 and you were just starting out writing, like what piece of advice would you give yourself?
Just because you write a bad sentence, a bad paragraph, a bad chapter, a bad plot line, or even a bad book does not make you a bad writer. As long as you're willing to go back and fix it and do the work necessary to grow and improve as a writer. If you look at examples of editing that authors have released, authors who are critically acclaimed and have been working for 30 or 40 years, you will see even those authors are ripping their sentences apart, are reformatting things, are changing and improving. The fact that you didn't get it right the first time doesn't mean anything. If you sit down at the piano and you don't know how to play a piano and you try to play a beautiful piece of music, you're going to do horribly. You're going to produce nothing but a cacophony of mistimed, mishit notes. And no one expects any differently. You expect to do badly if you don't have the experience to play a musical instrument. It's the same thing with writing. We get fooled because we all speak, we all use language, we all read, so we think we're going to be good writers the first time out. Unless you're Shakespeare, and even then, you probably aren't going to do well the first time out. So once you accept that mistakes are a natural part of the process, you become immune to them. You become bulletproof. So it's like, okay, I wrote a bad chapter. You know what? I'm not going to sit here feeling like I'm a bad author. I'm just like, oh, well, this is a natural part of the process. Revision is a natural part of the process. And I'm just going to keep proceeding down this process because it's going to lead me toward my ultimate goal. It took me many years to understand all of this. And I spent a lot of time feeling very bad as a young writer of like, oh, why am I not getting this? Why am I not getting this? And then I was like, oh, well, as long as I learn, as long as I grow, and as long as I'm willing to put the work in, I do get to where I want to go eventually. So why feel bad about it?
Fantastic advice. Absolutely. I'm not going to get it right the first try. So
No.
Just my first beta reader was my cousin, and she's like, well, it's a good idea.
That line.
Girls, yeah, but you need to start all over and throw it all away and hide it under your bed and burn it.
I mean, I basically had to rewrite To Sleep in a Sea of Stars almost from scratch. And that was rough because, a 300,000 word manuscript is, even if you're a fast writer, takes a lot of time to rewrite.
Oh, I can imagine. The book I'm writing right now is 75,000 words, and I'm supposed to add 5,000 more words for it to be like fantasy in its genre. And I'm like, I can't think of 5,000 more words I can put in here.
Just add in random descriptions of the rooms they're in.
Yeah. I have been doing that. I need to do that some more.
So your publishing house your editor wants you to hit what, 80,000 words?
80,000 words. So I pitched it to an agent at a conference a couple weeks ago, and she said that it needs to be 5,000 more words. Otherwise, she thinks that it hasn't been built out enough. The world building is there. So
interesting. Well, there is a category of novel that really isn't published these days, at least that I'm aware of, and that's the short novel. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is only about 34,000 words long. The Hobbit, conversely, I think is 95,000 words long. A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin are in the mid 40s. I think it's like 46, 47,000 words long. And it's a fully fledged novel. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a satisfying story and some interesting world building. But you don't really see novels published that length anymore, for the most part. And I'm not sure why, quite honestly. I think it might have to do a little bit with the fact that we no longer write in the omniscient point of view very much. Most stories are in limited third person, and that tends to lead to verbosity, because if the conceit is that we are locked into one character's point of view, then you kind of need to show everything they see and feel through the course of the story, and that just leads to pages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, mine is first person past. So.
Gotcha. I've never actually written in first person. Do you enjoy it?
My first book that I ever wrote, maybe not the first book I ever wrote, but the last book that I wrote was in third person and person limited. And I struggled getting my voice, hearing my voice.
Interesting.
But when I switched to first person, I picked up, I established my voice really quickly. So I actually really love it. I like it better. I just
you mean you established the character's voice?
Yes, the character's voice. Yeah, the character voice came across a lot clearer. I realized that I'm naturally better at it.
Yeah. Well, and that's always been the reason people have recommended first person to, especially, authors who are starting out, for exactly that reason. For me, I find that the use of the I conflicts with my own sense of I, and also you can run into the issue of, with first person, if it's past tense, you know the character has survived because they're describing everything past tense. Unless you do something where each chapter is like an entry in a diary and the character has only lived through that one day and now is recounting the past day, and then each time you're jumping ahead one day, and then if they don't survive, we don't get the next entry in the diary or something. That's almost a epistolatory novel, I suppose. But I mean, there are a few ways around that. But I mean, they're very successful novels written in first person. I've never tried it.
I was against it at first. When I thought of first person, I thought of Twilight. And not that I love Twilight, but I didn't.
Is Twilight first person? I don't remember.
Yeah, Twilight is first person.
Oh.
Yeah, so I don't know, like, I don't really know if I had a reason. I just felt like I wanted it. I think when I started, I thought that if you wrote in third person, you were a better writer. And I've moved away from that feeling, because I feel like first person makes me a better writer.
Interesting. Well, and if you enjoy it, that's ultimately what matters.
Yeah.
With third person, I definitely found that when I was starting out, I had some confusion over the voice also, excuse me, because you can write third person, and this sort of shades into omniscient a little, but you can write third person where there's essentially an invisible narrator who is recounting what's happening and what these characters are feeling. And that's a perfectly valid approach also. What I've moved a little bit more toward over the years, and To Sleep is a good example of this, is you can also really lock it in where you say, every single word that occurs on the page is my character's thoughts, feelings, or experience. And the vocabulary reflects their vocabulary. So I don't use any words that they wouldn't use. I don't use any phrases that they wouldn't use. It's all basically their experience filtered through third person. And that actually makes it easier for me to be more consistent with the character. Yeah.
Do you think you would ever try first person? Or do you think you just...
Yeah, probably at some point. I think it would be an interesting exercise. I just would have to think about what story first person would fit for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. Have you ever had an agent or an editor take your manuscript and say, hey, can you change this to present, past, or, some other type of perspective?
My manuscripts are too big for that in any case. I mean, no, I'm serious. Converting To Sleep, for example, converting the tense or the point of view would be a mammoth undertaking. I literally would rather write a new novel from scratch. So, no, I haven't had that experience. Maybe in the future.
Okay, I was just curious. We've had a lot of writers that have had that happen.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, third person past tense is kind of like the default these days. It's really hard to go wrong with that in a lot of ways. I'm tempted to try omniscient because I think it's very, very, very difficult to do, actually. And it used to be a lot more common. I'm actually reading this novel, Musashi, which is the story of the great samurai Musashi. And they say that this novel has sold 170 million copies in Japan. It's like their version of Gone with the Wind. The translation I'm reading, which I believe is the English, the main English language translation, is written. I mean, it's omniscient, and it's written in a style that is different from what we would do nowadays, because it was done in, I think it was translated in the 60s or something, 60s or 70s. And I find it almost kind of jarring. I'm just not used to omniscient. I'm like, but you were just in his head, and now we're in this person's head, and it's in the same scene, and so I think that would be an interesting challenge.
I think you would have to be a little bit more advanced to get that to work, like to perfect that. I think J.K. Rowling actually does that with Harry Potter, the first book. It starts out omniscient and then goes into third person limited. Very first chapter when you meet Dumbledore and McGonagall, that's omniscient.
Yeah. Well, actually, I do something similar in Eragon. The first chapter is essentially omniscient in the prologue, and then it swaps to third person limited, although it's like a gradual swap, because when we first meet Eragon, I describe him from the outside. I describe what we see from the outside, not what he sees or what he feels necessarily. And I didn't do that with To Sleep in a Sea of Stars so much. You'll notice that like Kira is only really described when she herself thinks about something with her own appearance.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you start out Aragon with like the Durza chasing scene, and then in
Yeah.
Save of Stars, you're like right in her head, and she's talking about her feelings.
Yeah.
And
although we have actually, now that I think about it, we have like 3-4 paragraphs right at the beginning of the first chapter, which are essentially omniscient, because we start with like this big camera view of where are we, what does it look like, and then I narrow down onto the character of Kira, and then once I lock onto her, I never really take the camera off her and her thoughts.
yeah, it's almost like a film
Yeah.
way of doing it.
Well, because it does help to have a little bit of a sense of what we're seeing and where we are. If you want to see like a true limited third person. Now, so for our viewers who perhaps are not entirely familiar with the differences between this, so omniscient means you have a God's eye view of everything. You can dip into anyone's head, you can see anything in the world, you can describe anything. You're God, and you can describe what you want. Third person is we're a camera that's following one person. We may or may not be inside their head, but the camera can see what's around and on the character, even if they themselves can't see it. So if the character cries and has a tear going down their cheek, the camera can describe and see that tear, even if the character can't see the tear, as an example. And then limited third person is the camera is inside the head, looking through the eyes and the body of that character, and doesn't change. And so if the character is crying and has tears on their cheek, we can describe what the tears feel like, but not what they look like, unless the character goes and looks at themselves in a mirror, for example. So where was I going with all of this?
Don't understand the different point of views.
Yeah, why was I explaining it? There was a reason I was explaining that.
It's because we were talking about all the different like ways that we were you start with the book, like you start with omniscient and then you focus into limited.
Yeah.
You're gonna see the stars. It kind of starts off with that like big camera view and then goes down.
Oh, I know where I forgot where. I need more coffee. That's why. If you really want to see like extreme third person limited, like an author who does not compromise at all with the third person limited, it's the science fiction author C.J. Cherryh. And I have a love-hate relationship with this technique of hers because it's incredibly immersive. She puts you in the mind of a character and she stays there with ironclad discipline. Now here's the downside of it. You can be halfway through a story of hers before you realize that the main character is on a space station, or that the main character has an alien for a best friend, because the main character never has a reason to think about those facts. Whereas, another author would tell you this is an alien she's speaking with, or, oh, we're on the space station in XYZ. No, unless the character thinks of it, sees it, or has reason to interact with this piece of information, C.J. Cherryh does not share it with you, the reader. And like I said, it can be a slightly confusing experience at times, but I really admire her purity of intent and discipline. She did one thing in one of her fantasy stories where there's a time loop. There's a little time glitch. And the way she dealt with it is you're reading through, and you almost don't even realize all of a sudden a paragraph from earlier repeats. And you think it's a printing error. It looks like a printing error. It looks like there's just some mess up, because she gives you zero clue that we actually just had a time glitch. And it's the first time I read it, I just thought it was a misprinted paragraph, because those happen. And then it was in retrospect, I was like, oh, you did. Oh, so.
Yeah,
So did you like that or not really? Were you like, I would have switched that a little bit?
I admire it. I don't know if I like it, but I admire it. Actually, I will say this. I like it because it stuck with me. I read that, years and years ago, and I'm still talking about it, But I do think that it costs you readers, because you're making your readers work harder. The readers you do have are going to love it and are going to be really devoted, but you make it difficult for the average person to just sink into your world and your story. So pick your battles, pay your prices, do what you want to do. But it's the same thing with like Cormac McCarthy. He doesn't use punctuation in a traditional manner. He writes in a very Baroque style that earns him some really devoted fans. It also costs him a lot of readers.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a crazy lot of information. Okay, well, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Have a good one.
Thanks everyone for watching. If you found that valuable, please be sure to join us next Wednesday when we have Christopher talk on marketing strategies, and he gets into the whole publishing world. If you haven't already, check out his newest book, To Sleep in a Sea of Stars. It is available on Amazon and where books are sold. Be sure to like, subscribe, comment, all the good stuff. And ring the bell so you'll be notified when our next video is up. Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.